Hello, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Dello. Thanks for being with us on ABC News and News Radio.
Tonight, a president under fire. The week began with the Atlantic's report that Trump called dead soldiers suckers and losers, and concluded with Bob Woodward's bombshell that Trump deliberately downplayed the risks of COVID.
And in between, there were a few other bombshells, including a book by Trump's lawyer Michael Cohen, where he dished on Trump's affairs and racism, and his other lawyer, Don McGahn, was revealed to be basically a double agent for Robert Mueller.
And we have a very special guest for you this week as well, Elizabeth Neumann, who was a senior official in Trump's Department of Homeland Security. She was in charge of identifying emerging threats, and basically, it turns out Donald Trump is one of them.
Meanwhile, will a COVID vaccine be Trump's October surprise? And will it matter as America heads towards 200,000 dead?
First, though, to the explosive revelations in veteran journalist Bob Woodward's new book, Rage. The reporter, who made his name, of course, during Watergate, didn't need a deep throat this time. His subject, Donald Trump, spilled the beans himself in no less than 18 interviews over the past year. And lordy, yes, there are tapes, 9 hours in total, although we've only heard 4 minutes so far. There's still quite a few highlights. In February, at a time when President Trump is publicly saying the coronavirus isn't a big deal and will soon go away.
You know, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat. Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. People die from the flu, and this is very unusual. And it is a little bit different, but in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's a little bit tougher. But we have it so well under control.
But this is what he was telling Bob Woodward.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. You know, the touch, you don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air, and that's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus. This is deadly stuff.
And yet 3 weeks later, he was still saying things like this to the American people.
It's a little like the regular flu that we have flu shots for. And we'll essentially have a flu shot for this in a fairly quick manner.
Well, this week, President Trump said he was simply trying to not panic people.
We don't want to have to show panic. We're not going to show panic. And that's exactly what I did. And I was very open, whether it's to Woodward or anybody else. It's just another political hit job. But whether it was Woodward or anybody else, you cannot show a sense of panic, or you're going to have bigger problems than you ever had before.
But Bob Woodward has told the US 60 Minutes program this week that deception was a failure of presidential leadership.
This is the tragedy. A president of the United States has a duty to warn. The public will understand that, but if they get the feeling that they're not getting the truth, then you're going down the path of deceit and cover-up.
Well, yes, but of course Bob Woodward knew all of that in February and waited until he was ready to publish his book in September to release the tapes. Meanwhile, this was Joe Biden's response.
On the day that we hit 190,000 dead in the United States because of COVID-19, we just learned from the Washington Post columnist Bob Woodward that the President of the United States has admitted on tape in February he knew about COVID-19 that had passed through the air. He knew how deadly it was. It was much more deadly than the flu. He knew and purposely played it down. Worse, he lied to the American people. He knowingly and willingly lied about the threat it posed to the country for months.
And that is possibly the crucial point here. Not wanting people to panic is fair enough, but not giving people the information they need to potentially save their own lives is quite another. Remember, this was at a time when President Trump himself was still refusing to wear a mask and holding a lot of big rallies.
I think wearing a face mask as I greet presidents, prime ministers, dictators, kings, queens, I don't know, somehow I don't see it for myself.
And as you say, John, the tweets were coming at the same time. February 27, quote, "It's going to disappear one day. It's like a miracle." March 10, along the lines of what you were just saying before. Last year, 37,000 Americans died from the common flu. Nothing is shut down. Life and the economy go on. At this moment, there are 546 confirmed cases of coronavirus with 22 deaths. Think about that. As you said, at the exact same time, he was telling Bob Woodward that it was 5 times deadlier than the flu.
Yeah.
So,
well, that was just the start of the news to come out of all of this. That was an important development. But he also let slip, the president did, that the United States had a top secret weapon.
I have built a weapons system that nobody's ever had in this country before. We have stuff that you haven't even seen or heard about. We have stuff that Putin and Xi have never heard about before.
Well, they've heard about it now, I guess, assuming they hadn't already heard about it because he'd blurted it out to them in the same way as he did to Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward did confirm with the US Defence Department that there is indeed a top secret weapon. The Defence Department was a little surprised to hear from Bob on the subject, that he even knew anything about it. And that really does represent an extraordinary lapse for any sitting president to, I mean, you know, he's basically saying, yeah, we got a military shuttle, sure, and we found little green men as well. This is pretty big stuff.
yeah, look, it's one thing to be indiscreet. It's nothing to be indiscreet to someone who is writing a book about everything you're saying. I don't quite know what to make of this because, on one hand, like you said, you expect the president to stop people panicking because the coronavirus stuff is what people are paying most attention to. And I mean, it's obviously ridiculous to suggest Donald Trump wanted to stop panic. He's Mr. American Carnage. He's Mr. The cities are burning. It's in fact, I believe in all seriousness that the Obama administration identified him as the #1 problem when it came to panic with Ebola.
Right.
That literally Donald Trump was the #1 issue. His constant tweeting about Ebola creating panic. So, yeah, obviously he wasn't that concerned about panic, but at the same time, we're acting like there was no other information at the time. Like I was there back in February. I remember that people didn't believe Donald Trump in February. I know his supporters believed him, and that's important, but it's not like we weren't aware that he probably was putting on a rosy picture.
Yes, I mean, we did talk a lot at the time about the president's happy talk, but there was a bit of a sense that maybe this comes from denialism, refusing to believe the experts like Fauci and others. But now that we know, no, he was simply lying.
Yeah.
He was misleading the American people. That's where it becomes, I think, potentially more damaging than a lot of, whether it's revelations in this book or a lot of the scandals that have come out in the last couple of years. Because here is an example of where Donald Trump was giving bad information to people who then, based on that, were taking unnecessary risks with their own health, including his own supporters at those rallies. And why was he doing it? Yeah, he could argue that he was wanting to prop up the stock market and keep share prices up and people's investment portfolios and their retirement funds and so on, keep them healthy. There's no point having a healthy retirement fund if you're dead. So it was a major miscalculation from him. And it is quite easy to be cynical and say, look, this is just about looking after your rich pals, not after the American people.
Yeah, look, that's true. I suppose the question is whether this makes any difference in terms of politics. Because, well, first of all, actually, before we even get to that, we should discuss the question you raised when you were talking before about should Bob Woodward have held on to it?
Yeah.
If Donald Trump actually did cause people to die, which I'm not convinced he necessarily did, but if he did, is it ethical for a journalist to hold on to that information to push his book 6 months later?
Yeah, look, it would have to be the first question. We've requested an interview with Bob Woodward, as has just about every media outlet around the world right now. If we get Bob Woodward on the show, the first question I would like to ask him is, if this was so important, why did you sit on it for 6 months? Was it because you had an agreement with President Trump that none of this would be published until September, that therefore you felt ethically, even though you had this information, you couldn't act upon it? Or because President Trump has leapt on this as his own defence to say, well, if this was so important, why didn't Bob Woodward tell people about it? The fact that Woodward sat on it says that it didn't matter that there was this disconnect between his private and public utterances.
Well, for a start, I find that an unconvincing defence from Trump. It's okay for journalists and media commentators to say that. For him to say that, why didn't Bob Woodward expose me earlier? That's a strange line for him to run, I should say. But what I would say is that Bob Woodward has answered those questions already to the Washington Post. He said that there wasn't an agreement. He could publish or put out information anytime he liked. He said the reason why he hadn't was because he didn't know if it was true, what Donald Trump was saying at that point in time, and he didn't know the full context for what he was saying. And he said it took months before he realised the full context of what.
So he's arguing that he didn't know whether the president was lying to him about the seriousness of COVID rather than lying to the American people about that it really wasn't that bad.
That's right.
Even though there was already quite a substantial weight of scientific evidence in February and March saying, yes, of course it's serious.
I'm just saying what he said. And Bob Woodward said that when he did know, three or 4 months later, he was of the opinion that he needed to deliver the story in its full context.
Yeah.
And that's his job.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the damage that this may or may not do to Trump, I mean, we've discussed a million times about the people who support Trump are not going to change their mind. The people who hate Trump are not going to change their mind. They're dug in. But I do think that we shouldn't be that this could still have an effect on the election. And because if for no other reason, 7 weeks out, he's 8 points behind. He doesn't need a whole week to be spent reminding people of how much he screwed up COVID. Because this is the one topic he does not want to talk about. We're not talking about law and order anymore. We're talking about this.
Yeah. And I think this taken in tandem with the revelations in Jeffrey Goldberg's piece in The Atlantic at the start of the week, the suckers and losers comments and the general disdain for the military, even those we discussed on Planet America on Wednesday night. Some of those allegations have been confirmed independently by other media outlets. Others seem a bit more dubious about, not wanting to go to the cemetery because of his hair getting dishevelled and all that kind of thing. But the picture that paints to America's 18 million veterans and their extended families, all of whom are usually very, very proud of the fact that they have a family member who served. So we are talking about a sizable chunk, maybe a quarter of the American population or more, who have a direct affinity to military service through the generations of their family, probably significantly more than that. This is affecting them. Trump dishing on foreigners, Trump dishing on immigrants, Trump dishing on other people is one thing. But when the bully in chief starts targeting you and your family, questioning your sacrifice or your family's sacrifice, this is his base that he is chipping away at here. On top of that, people that believed him, that it was okay, that it was safe to be going out. I mean, we had examples of, at the Democratic Convention last month of people coming forward saying, my father was a supporter of Donald Trump, believed him when he said it was okay not to wear a mask and to go out and reopen America. He got sick and he died as a result. He was betrayed by Donald Trump. That's an important narrative. Now, you're right, some of these people are going to be hard to budge, but I think that's why these two particular attack points it's a real vulnerability for Donald Trump, as opposed to the other two revelations we should mention in all of this as well. We had James Mattis, the former Defence Secretary, again using the word unfit to describe Donald Trump. That's a word that we've heard from John Bolton, Rex Tillerson and others. This is a building narrative, yet another former Trump insider saying, I've seen the president at work trying to do the job. He cannot do the job. He is unfit because, again, like Bolton, Mattis said that he has basically no guiding principles, no moral compass. It's all just about Trump and seeking re-election and getting his own political advantage in all of this, not serving the American people. And most remarkably as well, the former Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, an appointee of Donald Trump, who looked at Donald Trump over several years and his interactions with Russia. And Dan Coats, the head of National Intelligence, concluded there must be something going on with Russia because there is no other way to explain it. Putin must have some sort of leverage over Donald Trump. Otherwise, what Trump is doing is inexplicable. Now, he wasn't talking PP tapes there. He may have just been talking about a line of credit from Russian oligarchs that Trump would be bankrupted tomorrow if he had to repay all that money all at once. But still, that from an insider probably adds to this picture that has gradually emerged over the last 2 years of people that the closer you are to him, the more alarmed you are at the chaos and the unfitness of this president.
That was certainly, Dan Coates' opinion. I should say, by the way, we've been talking about this COVID thing and all of this as if it's just a given, but Anthony Fauci completely denies it. We've got a clip here.
I didn't get any sense that he was distorting anything. I mean, in my discussions with him, they were always straightforward about the concerns that we had. We related that to him. And when he would go out, I'd hear him discussing the same sort of things. He would often say, we just got through with a briefing with the group from the task force and would talk about it. So, no, it may have happened, but I I have not seen that kind of distortion.
So he's denying it. Then again, he might be trying to distract from the fact that he's also quoted as slagging Donald Trump off in that book.
Well, look, he's got to keep working for Donald Trump at least until the 20th of January next year. But we all saw what Donald Trump said in public and on Twitter, and now we've heard what he was saying to Bob Woodward, and that's, well, it's already been cut into Democrat attack ads, and well, we'll see if it moves that needle or not. But there is some more news on the COVID front and on the vaccine front this week as well.
Yes, look, government health authorities have had an interesting couple of weeks, John. It started 2 weeks ago when the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put out a new coronavirus guideline. They raised the bar on who should get tested, essentially. They advise that some people without symptoms probably don't need to be tested, even if they've been in close contact with an infected person. Now, that's strange advice, seeing as over half of coronavirus cases don't show symptoms. Even more concerning, an official told CNN that this guideline was coming from, quote, the top down. So people immediately thought of Trump's frequent calls for less testing, and it became a big controversy. Well, within 24 hours, the CDC walked that guidance back, saying testing may be considered for all close contacts or of confirmed or probable COVID-19 patients, which made the whole thing seem even more political in hindsight. But then on the very same day, we heard that AstraZeneca's American phase 3 vaccine trial had been put on hold because of political pressure. The FDA had apparently suggested a successful European trial might be good enough to start putting out the vaccine in America, even though doing so without an American trial would break all American standards. But then another minor controversy and the FDA backed down as well. To be clear, these phase 3 trials are important because they're the major test of vaccine safety. They test 30,000 volunteers, half of them get the placebo, and they wait until about 150 people in the pool have contracted the virus. Then they can see once and for all, does the vaccine work and does anyone get sick from it? It's important to not skip this step, even though it takes months. And that's why it's odd that just a week later, when none of these phase 3 trials had even gathered the 30,000 volunteers yet, the head of the CDC sent a letter to all governors asking them to waive requirements that would prevent their vaccine distribution facilities from becoming fully operational by the beginning of November, or as it's also known, election week. At this point in time, people were getting very nervous that the fix might be in and the administration might be about to foist a slapdash vaccine on the public, although the head of Trump's vaccine task force, Operation Warp Speed, tried to reassure people.
There is a very, very low chance that the trials that are running as we speak could read before the end of October, and therefore there could be, if all other conditions required for an emergency use authorization are met, an approval. I think it's extremely unlikely, but not impossible, and therefore it's the right thing to do to be prepared in case.
And yet again, Anthony Fauci tried some damage control as well.
I think most of the people feel it's going to be November, December, but that does not mean that if there are a number of infections within a particular trial that allows you to make a decision sooner rather than later, it is conceivable that you could have it by October, though I don't think that that's likely.
Well, maybe they will wait until the vaccine testing process is complete, but Trump making these kinds of super subtle allusions doesn't really help.
So we're going to have a vaccine very soon, maybe even before a very special date. You know what date I'm talking about?
It's around then that Morning Consult found that over half of their respondents thought Trump was influencing FDA decisions either a lot or somewhat. So then the 9 major pharmaceutical companies took matters into their own hands and promised to only even seek approval for their vaccines after they demonstrated safety and efficacy through a phase 3 clinical study that meets the usual requirements of the FDA. So, does that solve the problem? Not according to Kamala Harris.
So let's just say there's a vaccine that is approved and even distributed before the election. Would you get it?
Well, I think that's going to be an issue for all of us. I will say that I would not trust Donald Trump, and it would have to be a credible source of information that talks about the efficacy and the reliability of whatever he's talking about. I will not take his word for it.
Now, if you pay attention to precisely what she said there, she said she'd only trust someone other than Trump to declare a vaccine safe, which of course would be the case for any vaccine. So that wasn't a big statement, but the words she chose gave a very different impression, and it only added to the lack of trust out there about a potential vaccine. Then yesterday, the AstraZeneca trial, the very vaccine that the FDA speculated about shortcutting the process for, was put on hold due to a suspected serious adverse reaction in a UK trial. So there you go. Phase 3 trials are important. And John, in a CBS YouGov poll this week, only 21% of people said they'd take a coronavirus vaccine straight away, down from 32% last month. Has this thing just been completely compromised?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think Kamala Harris's comments help. Clearly, she was trying to make a point about Donald Trump's lack of credibility, and that's a reasonable point to make after hydroxychloroquine and everything else, and the not wearing of masks and so on, making a big show about convalescent plasma and so on. So he has been, frankly, a snake oil salesman on a number of issues so far. You can bet London to a brick that come late October, he's going to announce something and make it seem like the vaccine is going to be in your corner pharmacy next week. He's going to announce something to make it sound as though it's on the way. The Democrats, though, need to be making sure that they're not casting doubt over whether it is safe or not. Obviously, these things are going to have regulatory approval before they're brought out. But if they're going to be casting doubt on this, then they're creating a problem they may also have to fix themselves come the 21st of January next year. Because Trump's base already is disproportionately suspicious of things like vaccines and governments telling them to take vaccines or not. If Democrats are now thinking, well, this is a Trump vaccine where lots of corners have been cut, this could be dangerous. It's asking for serious trouble. But ultimately, it's tragic that just as it is with a number of fields of policy, climate change and everything else, that the science is getting completely overwhelmed by the partisan garbage on both sides.
Yeah.
And it's not a great situation.
It isn't. Needless to say, if a vaccine's only taken by 21% of people, it's useless.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
They've got a problem.
All right, the polls this week. 52 days today until the election, but there is already mail-in voting happening as of this week. As of next week, there will be early in-person voting in swing states such as Michigan. So basically, the election is on. Former Vice President Joe Biden this week extended his lead in the average of national polls to 7.5 points, and he has moved back above the 50-point mark on average. But, of course, as we know, this is not a national election. The Electoral College is decided by state-based votes, and that continues to show a much tighter contest. A series of swing state polls this week from the Democratic firm Change Research for CNBC has Joe Biden leading by just 3 in Florida, 6 in Michigan, 2 points in North Carolina, 4 in Pennsylvania, 6 in Wisconsin and 4 in Arizona. While the numbers have shifted around a little though, those margins are in fact identical to the same poll that came out just before the convention. So you could argue on the basis of that, no sign of a bounce either way. Here's the state of the race in the Electoral College this week. Average out all of the state-based poll averages. Joe Biden looks to be sitting pretty with 352 Electoral College votes to Donald Trump's 186. And we've got an update as well, Chaz, on the fundraising picture. We reported for you last week that Biden had hauled in a record-shattering $365 million for the month of August. Well, this week, the Trump campaign also announced its highest ever fundraising total for a single month. It came in at $210 million. Impressive, but still dwarfed by Joe Biden's mammoth effort. Neither campaign has yet announced their cash on hand, and ultimately, at this point of the race, that's really all that matters. Trump did have a $6 million advantage in July, but that's likely to have been erased now, despite the fact that Biden has been outspending Trump massively, about 2-to-1 in TV advertising throughout August. The Trump campaign has been refocusing its advertising spend as well, pushing more onto Fox News, suggesting perhaps that they're actually trying to shore up their base rather than to win over persuadable voters. Bloomberg News reported this week that Trump's campaign is in fact so cash-strapped that the president is considering spending $100 million of his own money in the final weeks of this campaign. He chipped in $66 million back in 2016 in his campaign. But Bloomberg also says this would be an unprecedented thing for any incumbent president to have to do, to put their own money into winning a second term. Usually if you're the incumbent, everybody wants to throw money at you. And of course, Michael Bloomberg knows an awful lot about self-financing campaigns, Chaz. According to the New York Times as well this week, Donald Trump's financial supremacy has evaporated. Of the $1.1 billion his campaign and the party, the RNC, raised from the beginning of last year through to July this year, more than $800 million of that $1.1 billion already spent. Republican strategist Ed Rowlands this week accusing the former Trump campaign manager Brad Parscale of, quote, spending like a drunken sailor. Parscale was demoted back in July. President Trump has explained his big spending campaign this way, though.
Because of the China virus, my campaign, which has raised a lot of money, was forced to spend in order to counter the fake news reporting about the way we handled it. China ban, etc. We did and are doing a great job and have a lot of money left over, much more than 2016.
So he had to spend all that money to counter the news coverage, but the truth, somewhat different. Almost half of the $800 million spent under Brad Parscale went actually on their fundraising operation itself, a massive spend on big data to try and seek out online donors, who no doubt helped to raise some of that $210 million back in August, Chaz, but and they could continue to donate at similar levels over the next 2 months until the election. But so far, this is not looking like a great return on investment, particularly given that Trump's poll position really hasn't improved over that time at all. It's a very large amount of money, $800 million to spend on losing by 7 or 8 points.
Yeah, and you say they're focusing their advertising on Fox News. To me, it looks like they're squibbing it completely. If you just have a look, in the last 2 weeks, don't know all of August, in the last 2 weeks of August, Biden spent $36 million on TV ads and Trump spent $5 million on TV ads. 7 to 1. That is not a good result.
Yeah. Everybody's got a view on whether early spending or late spending on TV advertising in particular, and we have less, obviously, the smaller sample size when it comes to the usefulness of online and digital. There was a conventional wisdom that says for an incumbent particularly, you have to front load your spending because you have to define the other candidate as negatively as possible before the conventions. Otherwise, they're off to the races. Obama did that very effectively against Mitt Romney in 2012. George W. Bush did it extremely effectively against John Kerry in 2004, at a period when Kerry was the one not spending money in the month of August. And then the outside groups piled on with Swiftboat Veterans for Truth and so on. We're yet to see whether Trump is going to be bailed out by outside spending. Ed Rowlands among the many who have pro-Trump super PACs out there that are spending some money. But if Trump's talking about maybe dipping into his own pocket for $100 million, why would Sheldon Adelson spend money on Trump when it might appear as though giving some money to Cory Gardner or somebody who's fighting to hang on to a Republican Senate seat could use that money a lot more?
Yeah, look, that is a great question. I should say the defining early theory, I don't think really applies in this case. Number one, because Joe Biden was very defined already. Joe Biden, everyone knew him going into this contest. He's not a newcomer. Secondly, Donald Trump doesn't define anyone because he flips around from one line to the next. He never keeps one line. Like he just, 1 second it's about Hunter Biden, the next second about China, the next second it's about Senile. He just flips around all over the place. So that theory doesn't work, I think, in that case. There is one other area he does spend his money on, though, which you haven't mentioned, which we should probably note, and that is he has the big get out the vote operation that Joe Biden does not have. Mm-hmm. Like they're doing 1 million door knocks a week, for instance. Joe Biden's doing 0 door knocks a week. Joe Biden's team is saying, no, we don't need it anymore. Phone calls, they do just as well. Mm-hmm. Maybe they do, maybe they don't.
Well, the counter-argument is, in the time of COVID, do you really want somebody with a clipboard knocking on your door saying, vote for President Trump? It's like, get off my porch.
They might be. As I said, we'll find out. We don't know. Because in the past, Obama was very good at the door knocking thing.
Yep.
And the people he was up against, like Mitt Romney, said the same things. Oh, the phone's fine. And it worked for Obama.
Yep.
So we will see.
Yeah, indeed we will. Now, if you're tuning in on Friday evening, it is, of course, September the 11th, a date that is still seared into most of our memories, synonymous with terrorism, fear and grief. But Unlike 19 years ago and the years that followed that, the focus of concern in the United States in 2020 isn't international terrorism. It's not Al-Qaeda or ISIS sympathisers. It is domestic terror, homegrown threats from the far right and even increasingly from the far left as well. To an extent, of course, that is nothing new, but it is a situation that some fear is being inflamed by the president himself. That is certainly a concern held by Elizabeth Neumann. She was the Trump administration's Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security and was in charge of identifying emerging threats. Elizabeth Neumann, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you for having me.
You were in the administration at the time. What was your response to the president's reaction to the 2017 neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville, when he famously said there were very fine people on both sides? Was that him pandering to the far right, or was that more just a superficial ego? He didn't want to say anything bad about people that like him?
I think that it is probably more the latter. He is very much about his ego and what benefits him. But I have come to the realization that even if that is the reason, at some point along the journey of becoming president and learning about your responsibilities as president and being confronted with the fact that your rhetoric is encouraging violence, that your rhetoric is encouraging an increase in hate groups. At some point, the mature adult takes responsibility for their rhetoric, apologizes, and then sends a very clear message that hate is not acceptable in our country, that violence will be prosecuted in this country and held accountable. And you haven't seen that from him as it pertains to these groups that support him. What you have seen instead is a pivot to focus on groups that are considered on the left side of the political spectrum. Antifa is the word that he likes to use, but really it's a collection of different groups that for different reasons might be politically active. Historically speaking, in the United States, especially in the last 10 years, these groups have not been lethal in their activities. The left-wing extremist groups tend to carry out civil unrest. They're disruptive to the local community. So it's definitely a policing issue. It's definitely something that the state and local law enforcement need to be aware of and need to address appropriately. But it has tended to not be seen as a federal government, national government problem because it is so locally based and they don't kill people. They do property damage. Environmental extremists might go and disrupt a pipeline, causing a lot of damage. So from a dollar's perspective, can be extremely destructive, but at the same time is not nearly the same type of violence that we have seen out of the right-wing extremists. Just by way of comparison, in 2019, the Anti-Defamation League, which is one of the groups that has been studying various types of attacks, domestic-based attacks, they said that in 2019 we had 17 attacks with 42 dead. 90% of those attacks were right-wing extremist-based attacks, which means, and they said of that 90%, the preponderance of it was white supremacist violence. The most notable attack last year in the United States was El Paso. But when you look at 2019 holistically from a global perspective, of course, the thing that stands out is what happened in Christchurch, close to where you are. And that certainly shocked the counterterrorism community. We had been talking with our allies. We've been talking with partners in Australia. Everybody was seeing this growing rise in right-wing extremism. But I think the moment that Christchurch happened, we realized, oh, the threat has already metastasized. It is here. This is not just a U.S. problem. It is a global problem. And sadly, the U.S. is an exporter of this violent ideology.
Now, Elizabeth, some people say that the far left don't tend to be as lethal as the far right, but just last week, someone from the far left murdered someone, and the brinksmanship between the far left and the police has been getting quite aggressive in places like Portland recently. Are you worried that the far left might be becoming more dangerous?
I am concerned that the last few weeks, we saw clashes between two different groups. You saw militia who seem to be hearing the rally cry of the president of law and order, take it upon themselves to go and protect small businesses and places that were the subject of looting and fires and violence. If the citizenry has confidence that their local government or state government are able to conduct their policing responsibilities, there is no need for a militia. So it's not that Donald Trump's not pointing out a challenge in a local area. It's that his solution to that is not to pick up the phone and talk to the mayor and say, how can I help you? Let us get you the best minds in policing to consult with you on how you deal with what is inherently an extremely complex problem. Instead, he just heaps fuel on the fire and then inspires these militias to show up, which actually causes the intensity of the tension to skyrocket. That kind of tension and his pattern of sowing division in our country, I think, is just going to increase as we get closer to the election. He sees it as a winning strategy, and he is not doing well in the polls. And when he is not doing well in polls, he tends to gravitate towards more extreme measures. So I think you're going to see increased rhetoric from him. You see on the left increased tactics they design for protest purposes to protect themselves, but in the process of protecting themselves, they're also becoming more capable of instigating that violence. They've learned from their experience where law enforcement uses rubber bullets or law enforcement uses tear gas, and so they've learned how to protect themselves from those tactics so that they don't get hurt. But in that process of becoming increasingly sophisticated, law enforcement then becomes more aggressive. So it's this tit for tat that just keeps ratcheting up and is not really effectively resolving anybody's problems, which is why we really need leadership to be able to start brokering some tough conversations to figure out how we move forward and not keep fighting each other.
Elizabeth, we've talked a bit about the way the president may be fanning the flames of violence on all sides at the moment, and it may fit into his law and order campaign as well to continue that in the next couple of months. But what about after the election? That period, potentially, if it's close, if we have an uncertain result on election day itself, how dangerous could that situation get, do you think?
I'm sure you've reported on the exercises that some universities did and brought in the best legal and political minds to kind of game out what are the different scenarios. It's scary what the conclusions they came to imply that in any scenario, we're probably looking at some form of pretty significant protesting. I think the question becomes whether it turns violent, and some of that has to do with the president's reaction and how he chooses to act if he loses. If he wins, I think there will still be protests. There will be a lot of people in our country just completely devastated because they feel, but maybe the better way to put it is both sides feel like this is an apocalyptic election. Both sides have bought into rhetoric that if their side doesn't win and the other guy wins, it's the end of the world as they know it. And there's arguments, for and against both of those perspectives. But anytime you have a people group feeling like it's the end of the world, that tends to not go well in terms of civil unrest and violence. But probably what law enforcement is most concerned about is the scenario where you have Trump losing and using the legal system to file complaints and so misinformation about the election being rigged, or that that the votes haven't all come in, or that you can't trust something. He's already doing this, right? He's laying the groundwork for a loss that he can then point to and say, see, I told you so. The mail-in ballot system is fraudulent. And, we have evidence in this state and this state that things were rigged. And it's that, not only is that just such, so against the nature of who we are as a people, what our democracy is about, the peaceful transfer of power, he has demonstrated that his rhetoric leads to violence. So I think what we're really concerned about is a prolonged inability for him to concede a loss, and how that might lead to people acting out in violence.
If there are 4 more years of what you've seen happen over the last year at the DHS, what is your greatest fear about what might happen?
Specific to DHS, I am concerned that the department's just going to increasingly be politicized. So that's probably the first thing I would be worried about. The next is that we just aren't focusing on the real threats, and at some point that will catch up with us. When you're consistently focused only on one thing, the wall and immigration numbers, not that those can't be important security issues, but there are also any number of other threats that we need to be paying attention to. Cybersecurity. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and they don't have a good plan to get us out. We have hostile nation states that are addressing using any number of vectors to hurt us. Election security is just one of them, but we have intellectual property theft. We have kinetic style attacks and concerns with both Iran and North Korea. All of those are at some point going to show up on our shores, and hopefully, if we have the right leadership and the department's able to do its job, we'll be prepared to address and meet that threat. But I am concerned that if he were to be reelected, we would not be able to do that. But we are losing the people that have the guts to say no, or have the guts to say, let's pause on that and think about this. And when you lose those guardrails in the process, and you're left with very inexperienced people coming up with ideas and then tasking out one of the most powerful nations in the world, that government, to go and do these bombastic things, it will lead us to a place of war if we're not careful. And so that's probably my nightmare scenario. It's that we end up in an accidental war, or an accidental situation with another nuclear power and a dictator that has their finger on that button, that could lead to devastating consequences for our country and for the world.
Elizabeth Neumann, thank you very much indeed for having a fireside chat.
Thank you for having me.
And that's just about all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. We will be back with Planet America on Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV. And if you missed this week's show with Rick Wilson of the Lincoln Project, it's on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube now.
And I'll have an all-new pet podcast as well. There is the address. But before we go, John, a rare piece of good news for President Trump at the end of what has been a pretty tough week.
Yes, Chaz. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating diplomatic normalisation between Israel and the UAE. A signing ceremony will be held at the White House next week. Although, fair to say, the nomination itself, it isn't actually such a big deal. There is a long, long list of people who can just nominate somebody. Just about any national politician can nominate somebody. Trump was nominated by a far right-wing Norwegian politician, Christian Tybring-Gjedde, who has also nominated Trump before, back in 2018. Same guy. Still, as far as Lou Dobbs on Fox Business is concerned, it's great.
Good evening, everybody. President Trump today had a great day, a day that any president could only dream of. President Trump started off the day with a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. That nomination comes weeks after President Trump brokered an historic peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It's an achievement that has eluded every president, every administration since the founding of Israel in 1948. And a member of Norway's parliament submitted the nomination and praised President Trump for his efforts to resolve conflicts worldwide.
Although that far right-wing politician actually said, I don't like a lot of stuff that Trump says, but he thinks that this is a pretty big deal.
I'm sure he'll take the nomination. Trump was certainly excited about it. He tweeted about it 17 times in the half hour after the nomination was announced. Although, look, to be fair, sometimes Trump does pull off diplomatic miracles.
Really?
He does, like the Serbia-Kosovo deal that was announced this week. I'll talk about that in the podcast, but part of it involves Serbia moving their embassy in Israel to Jerusalem.
Okay.
Something that the Serbian president apparently wasn't aware of. And I love the moment he realised what he supposedly agreed to halfway through the announcement.
This month, And to move its embassy to Jerusalem in July. That's fantastic. That's a big thing. That's a very big statement.
So this is where he looks through the agreement again. this is where he looks over to one of his staffers for help. And this is where he wonders, how the hell am I going to get out of this? Well, if Trump doesn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, he at least deserves a prize for winning an awesome episode of Veep. See you later. Good night.